Hi, everyone, and welcome to this Conversations on People and Culture. Today, I'm joined by Dave McCaughan, and we're going to explore some really exciting, interesting, relevant topics at the moment, including ageism, changing jobs when you're over 50, the portability of leadership and management qualifications, and the importance of storytelling for people and culture. Dave, welcome.
Thanks very much. Good to be with you, Campbell.
Fantastic. And can we kick things off? Can you tell us a little bit about what you do and your story?
Yeah, sure, mate. Sure. In brief, you hit on the right word, storytelling. What I tell people I do today is I help companies figure out their story. And so some of that is doing the market research for it. Some of it is taking other people's research. Some of it is just having a think with them and helping them frame it. But basically, it's about the fact that everybody and everything has got a story, but not everybody knows exactly not only what their story is, but what the story their audience wants to hear. And so I try to put that together, right? And I come at that from a personal long history of storytelling. So I actually spent 10 years, I don't know if I've ever told you this, I spent 10 years as a public librarian here in Sydney. In my 20s, primarily working as a children's storyteller in public libraries. Then I bummed around the world for a year, and then I ended up back here. And at 30, I accidentally got a job in an advertising agency, and truly accidental, but liked it and stuck with it, and joined this company called McCaughan, which at the time was the world's largest ad agency. Got lucky because after about 8-9 years working with them in Australia, where I was heading strategic planning, which is in the advertising world, what that basically means is you're the person that doesn't write the ads, doesn't create the ads, but you're the person that figures out what the ad should be about, okay? And then fortunately for me, the company transferred me to Asia for 2 years that turned into, well, now my wife and I lived in Asia for 26 years. I left McCaughan about 6 years ago, and I've been working as a sort of private consultant to companies all over Asia, telling them how to help with their stories, basically.
Yeah, fantastic. And I love this concept of storytelling, and I guess that's our connection. And just very briefly on storytelling, I guess most of the angle would have been storytelling the story of the brand to the people that you're selling to, or that you're engaging with. I'm fascinated. Can this also be useful for speaking internally? So telling your story to the people that work for you. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, definitely. In fact, very early on in my career in the advertising world, one of the earliest lessons I had back here in Australia was exactly that, where we were working with UPS, the courier people. And my boss at the time got a whole bunch of us to go, including him, and he was the head of one of the biggest ad agencies in Australia. He went and spent 2 days in a truck, dressed in the brown outfit. I don't know if you know UPS, they always wear these brown outfits. And he rode around with one of the truck drivers, and he made me do it, and a whole bunch of us did it, right? Now, the reason for that was because we were working on a whole new campaign that was actually being generated in the US by headquarters. And we had to figure out how to make it work in Australia. But what we thought was a great idea was for us to get the personal experience of what their drivers go through, but also just to sit next to a driver. And, if you're sitting around with a driver for a day or two, there's a lot of just, what's happening with the footy, what's happening with the cricket, blah, blah. And in the middle of all that, just explaining to this one guy, well, we got this new campaign we're working on. It's going to be like this, blah, blah, blah. And getting his reaction, but then also getting the feeling of, was he going to share that story with his mates? And then years later, I used to do a lot of work in China, and one of my biggest clients was Nestle. Now, the president of Nestle China was this German gentleman who, he'll never hear this, so I can say it to you. And, he wasn't the most pleasant man in the world, right? And basically most of his staff and all of his suppliers, like me, were scared of him. But he actually taught me some valuable lessons. And one of the lessons he said is, obviously, Nestle in China, like everywhere else, big company, you know, Nescafe, all those sorts of giant brands, spend a lot of money on advertising. But he said to me, you know, for all the money we spend on advertising, what's really important is the fact that he said, there's 100,000 people that matter the most. Now, this is China, right? So this is like 1 billion plus people. He said, there's 100,000 people that matter. And the 100,000 people were, he had about 10,000 people that worked directly for Nestle in some way across China. And he said, for every one of those people, they directly deal with 10 other people that are our suppliers or our direct customers. And he said, you know what, every time we do something important, it's more important that I get those 100,000 people on side. Because then he worked on the principle that as long as they were on side, nobody was going to say, oh, the product's bad or the ad's bad or whatever internally, right? And the other thing was, he made a good point, you know, which has really stuck with me. It's that, you know, it's the flow on effect. If your 10,000 employees buy into it and they tell the nearest 10 people to each of them in terms of customer suppliers, right, then they go home and tell their families, or they said, you know, when they see the ad on TV, they go, oh yeah, that's the new ad. It's pretty good, isn't it? And that's what you want, right?
Yeah. Oh, it's so powerful. You know, I hear and see organizations that create their culture and their vision and mission and those wonderful statements, but it's the executive that creates it. They love it. They believe it. They spruik it. But
Campbell, you got to, sorry, interrupt you, but you make a very good point. One of the issues that I quite often have as I help companies is the fact that they will write, you know, today it's very fashionable for companies to say we have values, right? And here's our values, right? But that is quite often a statement that's put in on, you know, on official documents, and it's sort of the thing that will get passed to in a press release, or it's something that will go out on your website. But it's amazing to me the number of times that I come across companies where nobody's actually sat with the cleaner in the office and explained, what does that mean to her?
Yes. Yes. What does it mean to them? It's not just some things on the wall, it's the actions of those values.
Yes. And quite often, of course, what happens is that you get those values are written quite often by somebody like me who uses sort of esoteric, trendy language that, put it in the context of Australia, right? So, you know, one of your clients has a factory. The factory has 100 workers in it. Now, no offense to those 100 guys, but they're probably not really into marketing jargon, right? And so what you want to do is you actually want to have a value statement, or you want to have an explanation of it that is in, you know, the old test, the famous old test of an ad is, or of a marketing idea is, you walk into the nearest pub, you pick the drunkest guy in the pub. If he can understand it, everybody can understand it, right?
Yeah. Makes sense. And I guess when it's in story form, it's not just some words and it's not clinical, but no, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Just to change tack for a moment, you've had a varied career. And I know that this topic of the aging workforce or changing jobs when we're over 50 is a particular interest to you. Now, one of the buzz terms of the recent past is this Great Resignation. Now, I don't particularly want to focus on the Great Resignation, but it does highlight and reminds me of two things. One, a lot of these people may be over 50, over 60, over 70, and may, need a job, or may want a job for whatever reason. And so I'd love to get your thoughts and experience on, changing careers, changing jobs. What is it? Why is it relevant? Your thoughts.
As you say, I've been interested in this in a while. Actually, my interest in the aging population goes back to 1988, when I was looking at some data from the latest Australian census. And the Census Bureau had written this document, which was predicting the population of Australia in 30 years from 1988, so in 2018. 2020, that sort of period. And it was saying that the population was going to age really dramatically. Now, as it's turned out, the population has aged, but not as much as they predicted. And that's because the government in reaction increased immigration dramatically, right? If you remember in the 90s, right? So we went up to sort of like 500,000 people a year from 200,000. And that slowed down the aging a bit. But going back to that, at that point, and obviously I was well below 50 at the time, I'm not that old, but at that point in 88, I started to investigate for different reasons what that might mean and what it meant about aging populations. And then as I expanded my role and started working across Asia, I started looking at this in all sorts of countries. And one of the things I started doing very early on in the early 90s was running a program across about 20 cities in Australia and Asia, where every week we would just do little roundtable discussions with just the general public, half a dozen people. And one of the things we started to do was to make one of those regular groups of people with groups of people in their 50s and early 60s. And what we found out nearly 30 years ago that we're still finding out today is that unlike our perception of old people, so if I stand in front of an audience at a conference or, in front of a client and I say, let's talk about the over 50s or over 60s, doesn't matter who you're talking about, suddenly people in their head get pictures of their grandmother, right?
Yeah.
They do. But the reality of it is that if you actually go out and look at the marketplace and you look at, say, the over 50, over 60 population here in Australia, what we discovered very early on was that even then, and those people now, when we were looking at 55-year-olds 30 years ago are now 85, but every generation coming through of older people are what we call new life builders. And the reason I came up with that term and I perpetuated that term is because I kept on finding out that despite the image that we have of aging, the truth is that in today's world, people hit 50, 55, 60, and 50 years ago, if you hit 60, that meant you probably had 10 years to live. If you hit 60 today and you're an Australian, you've probably got somewhere between 25 and 35 years to live. See, now, in other words, you've got a third of your life to go. Now, there are different financial situations and all that sort of stuff, but the reality is, and the other example of that is today, mate, when you were growing up, when I was growing up, if your parents were talking about somebody died and they died at 70, you'd go, oh, that's pretty good, had a good life. Yeah. If somebody dies at 70 today, you go, oh shit, that's young, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So of course, people are conscious of that. So what we're finding is that people in their 50s and 60s are very conscious of the fact that they're probably going to live for another 20, 30 years of fairly good health. And what the hell are you going to do? Right?
That's the thing.
Right? And that's the thing. And that's the thing the business leaders have been very slow to wake up to, which is the fact that, first of all, there's misconceptions. There's the misconceptions that people over 50, well, they don't buy stuff. Wrong. Every study in all the developed countries of the world, including Australia, shows that 50% in every category you can think of, 50% of the value of the category every year is purchased by people over 50, right? From motor cars to travel, but to cosmetics, to food, to restaurant spends, okay? These are the people that spend money. Secondly, the other thing is there's the misconception about technologies. People over 50, they're hopeless at technology. Now, part of that is because nobody's helping those people figure out new technologies. Everybody's so discouraging because the social dialogue goes, Dave, you're 60, mate. You can't possibly learn how to use this, right? Yeah. And one of the misconceptions we have to remember is that people that are now in their 50s in Australia have lived a very, very technologically dynamic life, right?
100%. I mean, I'm 50 and I am a technological baby.
We sometimes forget. Yeah, we sometimes forget. For example, if you're 50, we sometimes forget somebody 50 today was the first generation to ever use smartphones, right? The first generation to use digital cameras, right? And to learn to use those things.
Yep.
And so the bosses of the world, the industry leaders, the company managers, who quite often are in this age group themselves, for some reason forget about their own experience and don't generalize that, hey, you know, I know how to use this stuff. I'm interested in this stuff. So let's get out there. The biggest issue, though, of course, is retraining. You know, we're terrible at retraining people and giving them the options.
Yeah.
And so one of the stories, if you like, that maybe with the election, I don't know, but certainly the government in Australia, but businesses in Australia at all levels have to learn is how to tell the story and appreciate the story of older people who have retrained, relearned, repositioned, and have a desire to go on. And by the way, the third myth is, well, it's no point training these people because, you know, they're all going to retire soon, right? Now, and here's the other thing. Yes, of course, you know, when you're my age and you're in your early 60s, right? And I have some friends, mates of mine that I went to uni with or whatever, that have retired already, and they're all bored, brainless, right? And what you're finding is a lot of people, if they financially can retire, are still looking for stuff to do, right?
Yeah, and I think that's the thing.
Yeah, you know, and so you've got this range of, you've got people who have been active all their lives. Suddenly they're not going to stop and do nothing but play golf every day for the next 30 years, right? Because believe me, even golf gets boring if you're playing it every day. And then at the other end, you've got a whole swag of those people who may not financially be able to say, look, I'll be great for the next 30 years, right? So I need to still make some money, maybe not a full income, maybe a varied income, maybe it's seasonal jobs or whatever. So we need to have a greater mix in that workforce, right?
Yeah, definitely. No, and that all makes perfect sense. And what fascinates me and interests me is a lot of people, by the time they get to mid 50s, and they might be looking for a change in organization, not necessarily a change in career, but I'm thinking, you know, they've been managing business units or are managing a retail store or these kind of things. They've decided personally that they didn't want to become the CEO or the managing director, because not everyone can, not everyone has the skills, not everyone has the desire and drive. Now, they might want to change organizations, refresh, but go in at some kind of middle management level, happy to do that and be productive. And they would add enormous value because they've got so much experience. And what I hear and what they tell me is they get passed over for jobs because they don't have a formal qualification to someone younger who's just got a Bachelor of Business but no experience, and they become frustrated and say, well, I've got 25 years of experience managing and leading people, but I don't have the piece of paper. And you know, that's a real passion of mine, and I know we've spoken about it a bit. And you know, to me, I'm interested in individuals telling their own story, you know, and we're talking about storytelling, and they're not going to have, if you're 50, you don't have a current resume. If you're wanting to change jobs, right, you know, change from this store to another retail management position or warehouse management position, you don't want to come in at that level. You want to go back in at an operations level. And it's helping these people tell their own story. Does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. I mean, I hear this all the time of people who say, you know, it's very hard for people that are in a management position, no matter what level, to understand that somebody over 50 might want to step back or step down, right? Or step over to a different industry. And, you know, I was just talking to somebody a couple of days ago who was 56, I think. He was telling me how he tried to get a job, and it was basically as a 12-month project manager. Okay. Now this guy has been literally the managing director of a small advertising agency overseas. He worked in many parts of the world. He's got a ton of experience, but but you never actually worked as a project manager.
Yes.
Right? But he didn't, on his CV, he doesn't have a title that says project manager X. And you go, this guy's managed lots of projects, right?
Yeah.
So to your point, he doesn't have the formal qualification, whatever that might be, but he's got all the experience that you would need to do that role, right? And then because of the age thing, it's sort of like, oh, well, you don't want to step back down to this. And he's basically, yeah, but
you're overqualified.
Yeah, well, you're overqualified. You're overqualified. It's like, no, you don't understand. I don't want to be a managing director anymore.
Yeah.
I don't want to have to deal with finance directors all day long. I just want to manage projects and and see stuff happen, right? And
add value to the business. I mean, and that's the thing. There's so much value. I think part of it is this concept that you always need to be ambitious and always pushing up. That's fine. I get that. However, as we're talking about aging population, and if we're living into our 90s, there comes a time when you just want to derive some income and help people, but not so that you can, keep being promoted. And I think that's a cultural shift that we need to accept. It's not just all about growth. We can have personal growth without getting promotions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've seen it many times. I've seen it in all sorts of companies, like ones I've worked in and ones, that I've had as clients. But if you take advertising agencies as a classic example, advertising agencies have this mentality that you've got to be constantly getting promoted until they retrench you, and then you're gone. Right. And they have that based on a historical context. But every now and again, you'll find this example where somebody's woken up and go, no, that guy's really good at that. Right. Stop trying to make him that or that. Just why don't you pay him to do that job well? Right. And I've seen that a few times, and it's been like, yeah, that's the way we should go. Right, we've got to reconfigure the way we think about that never-ending promotion cycle. The need to go to the next level. Yeah.
That's not the answer. So just to encapsulate what we've spoken about, I think there was a couple of key things that you mentioned there. I just really want to stress to people watching a couple of things that we've mentioned. One is storytelling for themselves. If you're, it doesn't matter whether you're 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, on that resume or CV, it's building your own brand story through in a storytelling way, having that conversation, because that's building your own personal brand, so that you when it does come the time, if you're wanting to change jobs in the future, then, you've got a story behind you of what you've done. It's not just facts and figures. That's important, but there's a story there. And I think secondly is the fact that experienced people, if you have the skills and knowledge, you don't need to study and spend a lot of money to gain a qualification. And I know that's what we do. And this is not a sales pitch, but it's more making people understand the reality is that you can get recognized for the skills and knowledge that you already have using recognition of prior learning. You don't need to study, you don't need to do it, and it doesn't cost a lot of money to gain that qualification. Dave, final thoughts on, advice that you can give to people watching today that, whether it be on the aging workforce or storytelling?
Well, on storytelling, look, I always go back to this. Everybody's got stories to tell. Every business has got stories to tell. One of the things that people make the mistake of is thinking about the structure of the story, right? So it's like, oh, blur, I'm just going to tell you all this stuff. But storytelling is about structure, right? So beginning, a middle, a twist, and an end. And the key to all good stories, I also use the Star Wars example. Remember the moment with Darth Vader, I am your father. It's like, holy shit, where'd that come from, right? The twist is always the key. And if I could advise anybody, yourself included, when you're thinking about the story you want to tell, think about what's the twist, because the twist is the unexpected bit that people are going to go, oh, wow, that's interesting. And that's the memorable bit, right? And I think that's the key. And it goes for when you're telling the story about yourself. I mean, if you're thinking about your qualifications and stuff, people don't often think about what makes you unique, the twist that makes you unique, right? It's, well, I've done this. Yeah, that's great. but what's that one thing that you can go and people go, really? You did that? You know, and that will make a difference, right?
Yeah. Well, fantastic. Thanks for joining us today, Dave, and look forward to catching up again soon.
Thanks, Campbell. Good luck to you, mate. Cheers.